Scrum has become simpler over the years. There's many specific practices that have been removed from the Scrum framework, and you can always find the current definition of Scrum at scrumguides.org. It's authored by and supervised by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, who are the founders of Scrum. Let's first start talking about roles and changes in the roles. The product owner used to be separate and outside of the Scrum team. And in fact, there was a lot of restrictions on how the product owner could interact with the Scrum team. Over time, what's happened is that the experience of working with Scrum in the real world is that the more closely that the product owner works with the Scrum team, the more effectively that Scrum team will be able to deliver value to the marketplace. That tight interaction is actually something that's referred to in the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. Business people and teams should interact daily. So, the product owner is a full member of the Scrum team. They didn't used to be. They used to be not a member and quite restricted in their interactions. As well, it used to be the fact that the Scrum Master, the developers, or the product owner could cancel a sprint. That led to some problems. It was a little bit too free. And so that's actually been restricted now to the product owner. Only the product owner can cancel a sprint. That authority is limited to the product owner because it has such an impact on the delivery of value. The product owner is now allowed to be a member of the development team. In other words, the product owner is allowed to contribute to the development work, any kind of development work for the product increment. The Scrum team is self-organizing, which includes the product owner self-organizing and volunteering for some of that work. The Scrum Master is also now allowed to be on the development team. Similarly to the product owner, the Scrum Master is no longer completely isolated. Many Scrum Masters come from technical backgrounds. It was just natural that they would be able to contribute. Scrum Masters are no longer required to conduct meetings. So I mentioned earlier that the Scrum Master does facilitation. The big picture of that facilitation is to actually help everyone on the Scrum team learn how to be effective in the meetings, so that other members of the team chair meetings, for example, or facilitate meetings. The Scrum Master is still responsible for the effectiveness of Scrum, but they're no longer required to be the person actually conducting meetings. The Scrum Master is no longer required to remove obstacles in 24 hours or be fired. When I took Scrum training in 2003, I heard from Ken Schwaber himself that the Scrum Master was meant to be super aggressive about obstacles and deal with them as quickly as possible. The problem is that that led to a lot of Scrum Masters getting fired. So, Scrum Masters are still required to help the team with impediments, but there's no longer a time limit on it. I hope that good Scrum Masters would know when to be assertive and know when to move quickly, but many obstacles are organizational in nature and take a lot longer than just 24 hours to be removed. There are some process changes as well. The Scrum process no longer includes release sprints. When I took Scrum training, release sprints were still a part of it. And the idea was very simply that you do, usually 4 or 5 sprints, then you do a special kind of sprint to kind of clean up and prepare everything for actual release. Technology has moved a lot in the last 15 years. We now have cloud-based stuff, we have DevOps with tons of automation. Releasing as a separate activity no longer requires a sprint. Instead, it's something that could even be done continuously. Continuous integration and continuous deployment, for example, are software practices that allow you to release pretty much at any point. Releasing is no longer synchronized with sprints or with a special sprint. Releasing can be done anytime. And because of that, Scrum no longer includes release planning. That was previously a separate meeting that was conducted by the product owner. Scrum now says, actually, there is no requirement for planning at all from a long-term perspective. Scrum does not require project planning.
Scrum does not require a product roadmap. Scrum does not require anything but a few ideas about what to do next. Start a sprint, do it, get some feedback, get a few more ideas, and do it completely on demand. You may still do planning. It is not a requirement to do long-term planning in Scrum anymore. Finally, in the sprint planning meeting, the team creates a forecast, not necessarily a detailed task list. When teams created task lists, it felt too much like a commitment. Teams were getting really discouraged when they wouldn't complete all the specific tasks. Instead, the forecast is designed to be a more comfortable idea that allows self-organization. The commitment is to the goal of the sprint, not to the detailed task list, or for that matter, not even to the specific product backlog items. A few things have been removed from the artifacts. Scrum no longer includes sprint burndown charts or release burndown charts. They're an option, they help with transparency, but they're no longer actually required. And part of the reason for this is because there's many ways of doing these charts, but also because there's many other ways of creating the transparency necessary to show progress. Likewise, the obstacle list that the Scrum Master maintains is no longer a required artifact. That was removed many years ago. If you come up with a better way of showing progress throughout a sprint than a sprint burndown chart, you're welcome to do that. That's a technique that Scrum no longer requires you to do. There's also some terminology changes. Grooming was renamed to refinement, and that had to do with some very negative connotations that the word grooming has in parts of the world. Please start using the phrase product backlog refinement or just refinement instead. Another one that's important, again, more psychologically, is the concept of prioritized backlog renamed to ordered backlog. If it's ordered, it's actually a sequence. There's an order, a number 1, a number 2, a number 3, a number 4, and it's a sequence that will be done rather than clumps of priorities. Oh, this is high priority, or this is medium priority, this is low priority. And that distinction is important so that the product owner and the Scrum team really know the protocol or the policy around the items that they need to choose from the product backlog. It's the first one, and then the second one, etc. Shippable was renamed releasable. This is just a subtle thing, not terribly important. When you release, you may be releasing into the marketplace, you might be releasing internally. Shippable had some connotations that were confusing people. Finally, Scrum Master with no space was renamed to Scrum Master with a space. I have no idea why that change was made. Subtle, probably not terribly important, but for what it's worth, that's a change. There are some miscellaneous changes. Some of you have been around Scrum long enough might remember the chicken and pigs analogy. This is an analogy that was used to describe the sort of accountability and responsibility within the Scrum team versus outside of the Scrum team. Some people found the analogy offensive, and it was removed. The Scrum Master secret handshake was removed. I know that I was required to train people to learn the secret handshake. I'm not going to share it, but it had something to do with sheepdogs. It was a way of creating, I guess, a camaraderie or something like that. For whatever reason, it was removed 10 years ago. Interestingly, the Scrum values were removed from Scrum for about 5 or 6 years, and then they were reinstated. So one thing that you should know about Scrum is that it is open source in the sense that the community can make suggestions for changes to Scrum. There's a way to provide feedback through a system called user voice. Someone suggested on user voice to add them back. It was extremely popular. There was lots of great suggestions. There was a little bit of controversy about some of the values. In 2016, a new version of the Scrum Guide was released with the values reinstated. Many of the specific detailed changes in the Scrum Guide have come from that community involvement. I strongly recommend going over to scrumguides.org and seeing what's happening there.